There is a library in the Vatican that holds some of the most extraordinary documents ever to survive from the ancient world. Papal decrees, illuminated manuscripts, and the correspondence of emperors fill its shelves. But in 1815, a scholar working in a completely different library in Milan made a discovery that stunned the world of classical studies. Beneath the ink of a medieval religious text, hidden beneath layers of overwriting, he found something that no one had expected to find. He found the private letters of Marcus Aurelius. These were not the meditations that have made the philosopher-emperor famous across 20 centuries. These were something altogether more human, more surprising, and in many ways, more revealing. These were the letters that passed between a young prince and his beloved tutor, a man named Marcus Cornelius Fronto, who was at that time considered the greatest orator in the Roman world. In them, we find a side of Marcus Aurelius that his famous philosophical notebook never quite shows us. We find a boy who was uncertain of himself, a student who struggled and doubted, a man who loved deeply and grieved openly, and a prince who was being shaped, word by careful word, into the ruler of an empire. Tonight, we will follow that correspondence across more than 3 decades. We will sit inside the schoolroom of one of antiquity's most fascinating friendships. We will read over shoulders, listen to whispered anxieties, and watch as 2 very different minds reached across the formality of Roman imperial life to find something remarkably tender. This is not the story of a great emperor's conquests or his philosophy. It is the quieter, stranger, and, perhaps more, beautiful story of how he was made. So, just settle in, let the world outside grow distant, and let us travel back to the sun-warmed gardens and marble corridors of ancient Rome. To understand why these letters matter, we first need to understand the world in which they were written. The Rome of the 2nd century AD was, by almost any measure, at the absolute height of its power and confidence. The empire stretched from the deserts of Mesopotamia in the east to the misty highlands of northern Britain in the west. It encompassed more than 5 million square kilometers of territory and governed, at its peak, somewhere between 50 and 70 million people. Its roads connected cities that had once been separated by weeks of dangerous travel. Its aqueducts brought fresh water to populations that had never known such abundance. Its legions guarded frontiers that ran for thousands of miles. And yet, for all that engineering and military might, the Romans of the educated class believed with absolute conviction that the thing that truly separated them from barbarism was not their army or their roads. It was their language. It was Latin, wielded with precision and elegance, that they considered the highest mark of civilization. To speak well was to be Roman. To write well was to be powerful, and to master the full rhetorical arsenal of the Latin tongue was to hold a kind of social and political authority that no sword could quite replicate. Marcus Annius Verus was born in April of the year 121 AD into a family of Spanish origin that had, over generations, climbed to the very summit of Roman aristocratic life. His grandfather had been a consul 3 times and had served as prefect of Rome itself. His family's connections ran deep into the Emperor Hadrian's court. From the very beginning, Marcus inhabited a world of exceptional privilege, but also of exceptional expectation. Roman aristocratic boys were formed by their education the way that clay is formed by a potter's hands. Everything that mattered, everything that would determine their usefulness to the state and their standing in society, was a product of their schooling. And schooling, for a boy of Marcus's rank, meant, above all, one thing. It meant rhetoric. Marcus Cornelius Fronto was, by the time he became the young prince's teacher, already legendary. He had been born in Sirte, in what is now northeastern Algeria, probably sometime around the year 100 AD. North Africa was, in the 2nd century, a place of remarkable intellectual vitality. It would later produce Tertullian, Apuleius, and eventually Augustine. Fronto belonged to this tradition of African Latin, a style that was considered by many Romans to be more vivid and more daring than the polished urbanity of the Roman-born rhetoricians. He had risen through the cursus honorum, the traditional ladder of Roman public offices, with distinction. He had served as a suffect consul in 143 AD and had been appointed governor of the province of Asia, though he eventually declined that posting on grounds of poor health. He had argued cases before the emperor himself and had been considered by many of his contemporaries as the only real rival to Cicero for the title of Latin's supreme master. That comparison to Cicero was not made casually. In Rome, it was the highest compliment a man of letters could receive, and it was this man, this celebrated, authoritative, brilliantly verbal man, whom the Emperor Hadrian and then his successor Antoninus Pius chose to form the mind of the future ruler of the world. What makes this choice so interesting in retrospect is how it sits in tension with what Marcus Aurelius eventually became. The Meditations, the work by which we know him today, are saturated with Stoic philosophy. They owe almost nothing to the rhetorical tradition that Fronto embodied. They are concerned not with how to speak beautifully, but with how to live well, not with impressing audiences, but with governing the self. So what happened between the schoolroom and the throne? The letters give us a window into that transformation, and what they reveal is far more complicated and far more human than a simple rejection of one master in favor of another. The story of how we came to have these letters at all is itself remarkable enough to deserve a moment of attention. For more than 1,000 years, Fronto was known to the Roman world almost entirely by reputation. Ancient writers quoted him, praised him, and held him up as a model. Aulus Gellius, a scholar of the 2nd century, wrote enthusiastically about having heard Fronto speak. Jerome listed him alongside Cicero as one of the towering figures of Latin prose. But the actual texts of his major orations, his treatises, his correspondence, had all apparently been lost in the general destruction that overtook so much of classical literature during the turbulent centuries after Rome's fall. Then, in 1815, a cardinal named Angelo Mai was working in the Ambrosian Library in Milan on what appeared to be a routine examination of a medieval manuscript. The manuscript contained the works of a 4th century Christian writer. But when Mai examined the parchment closely, he noticed something extraordinary. The manuscript was a palimpsest. Parchment was expensive in the medieval world, and scribes frequently scraped old texts off used pages and wrote new ones on top. The old text beneath, incompletely erased, was still partly legible. And what Mai could make out, ghost-like beneath the Christian theology, was a correspondence in Latin. A correspondence between Marcus Aurelius and Fronto. He was electrified. The discovery made international news in the scholarly world, but it also came with a complication. The letters were incomplete, damaged, and jumbled. Many were missing their opening or closing lines. Some could barely be read at all. Others were present only in fragments so brief that their meaning was almost impossible to determine. The two men had apparently written to each other prolifically over the course of decades, but what survived was, at best, a patchwork. Still, even in that fragmentary state, what the letters contained was enough to transform our understanding of one of history's most admired figures. The earliest letters in the collection date from a period when Marcus was still a very young man, probably in his late teens or very early 20s. He had already been designated by the Emperor Hadrian as a future successor, a fact which gave his education a peculiar weight. This was not a boy learning rhetoric for the ordinary purposes of legal pleading or political oratory. He was learning it because the ruler of Rome was expected to be the master of Latin eloquence, the living embodiment of the tradition that stretched back through Cicero to the Republic itself. In one of the earliest surviving letters, Marcus writes to Fronto with a mixture of eagerness and anxiety that is immediately recognizable to anyone who has ever been a student. He reports on his progress in declamation, the practice of composing and delivering speeches on set themes, which was the central exercise of rhetorical education. He is clearly trying very hard. He is clearly also uncertain whether he is trying hard enough. There is a quality in his writing, even at this early stage, of someone who takes everything seriously, perhaps too seriously, and who cannot quite bring himself to believe that his efforts are adequate. Fronto's replies in those early years have the precise warmth of a great teacher who knows exactly how much encouragement his student needs and exactly how much honest criticism will push him forward without crushing him. He praises Marcus for specific things, not in general terms, but with the particularity that shows he has actually read closely. He comments on word choices, on the rhythm of sentences, on moments where the argument becomes muddled, or the imagery becomes strained. And then, often at the end of a letter full of gentle corrections, he adds something personal, something affectionate, that reframes the entire relationship not as master and pupil, but as something closer to family. One of the things that strikes any modern reader of this correspondence almost immediately is how openly, how warmly, how almost extravagantly the two men express their love for each other. This is not the restrained, formal language of teacher and student performing their prescribed social roles. It is something richer and more surprising. Fronto calls Marcus by endearments. He refers to him as his light, as his delight, as someone more precious to him than any other person in his life. Marcus, in turn, writes to Fronto with a devotion that goes well beyond professional admiration. In one celebrated passage, he tells Fronto that he loves him and misses him, and that being apart from him is genuinely painful. He compares his feeling for his teacher to the feeling a person has for someone they cannot bear to be without. He is, in other words, using the language not of academic respect, but of genuine personal love. Modern readers sometimes struggle with this. We tend to project our own categories onto the past, and affectionate language between men of different generations can seem, through a contemporary lens, either suspicious or simply strange. But in the Roman world, and particularly in the context of the mentor-student relationship that had deep roots in Greek intellectual culture, this kind of expressed devotion was not unusual. It was, in fact, expected. The relationship between a great teacher and his student was understood to involve a kind of love. What makes the Fronto Marcus letters remarkable is not that the feeling existed, but how directly, how unguardedly, how beautifully both men gave it words. The letters are not only about affection, of course, they are also about ideas. And one of the most fascinating recurring themes in the correspondence is the debate, implicit at first and then increasingly direct, about what rhetoric is actually for and how it relates to philosophy. Fronto was, fundamentally, a rhetorician. He believed that the proper goal of educated effort was mastery of language. He was, in this sense, the heir to a tradition that went back to the sophists of classical Greece, to the belief that the well-trained speaker could argue any side of any question with equal skill, and that this ability was itself a form of wisdom. For Fronto, beautiful Latin was not merely a means to an end. It was something close to an end in itself. The right word in the right place was a kind of moral achievement. But Marcus was already, even as a teenager, being drawn toward philosophy, and specifically toward Stoicism, a school of thought that was deeply skeptical of rhetoric's claims. The Stoics believed that fancy language was dangerous, that it could dress up false arguments in attractive clothes and mislead people who were not vigilant. They believed that wisdom was not about speaking well, but about thinking clearly and living virtuously. And they were suspicious of any intellectual activity that did not directly serve those goals. Fronto is quite candid in the letters about his distrust of philosophy and of Stoicism in particular. He worries that it is pulling Marcus away from his proper studies. He writes, at various points, about the dangers of becoming too absorbed in abstract speculation, of losing the practical, civic-minded orientation that a future ruler will need. He is not anti-intellectual. He is, himself, a deeply thoughtful man. But he believes that thought should issue in action and in speech, not in contemplation for its own sake. The letters show us these two sensibilities rubbing against each other across years of correspondence, never quite resolving, but also never quite breaking the bond between the two men. What makes Fronto such a fascinating figure in these letters is not simply his warmth, but also his willingness to be difficult. He is not a flatterer. He does not tell the future emperor what he wants to hear. He tells him what he thinks is true, and he does so with a directness that must have been bracing for a young man surrounded by courtiers trained in the art of gentle deception. In one remarkable exchange, Fronto criticizes a piece of Marcus's writing quite sharply. He tells him that the passage in question is not as good as Marcus seems to think it is, that there is a kind of self-satisfaction in it that is not warranted, that the argument would have been stronger and the style more precise if Marcus had been less eager to demonstrate his learning and more determined to actually say something true. This is not a mild rebuke. Coming from a man of Fronto's authority to a man of Marcus's power, it is an extraordinary act of intellectual honesty. And what is even more extraordinary is Marcus's response. He does not become defensive. He does not pull rank, does not remind Fronto who he is speaking to. He accepts the criticism with what seems to be genuine gratitude. He thanks his teacher for not sparing him, for caring enough to tell the truth. This exchange tells us something important about both men. It tells us that Fronto had created a relationship safe enough for honest criticism. And it tells us that Marcus was the kind of student who could hear hard things without hardening in return. Marcus, in several letters, reports on the quality of his rest with the careful attention of someone who takes the subject seriously. He notes when he has slept well and when he has not, when he has risen feeling refreshed, and when a difficult night has left him heavy-headed. He links sleep directly to his capacity for study and reflection. After a bad night, he finds his mind sluggish, his arguments less precise, his concentration harder to sustain. After a good one, everything comes more easily. He is, in this, thoroughly modern. He has discovered by experience what we now know by neuroscience, that the quality of rest is not a trivial matter, but one of the foundations on which intellectual life is built. Fronto, who suffered from various physical ailments throughout his life, including what appears to have been a form of gout that caused him considerable pain, writes about sleep from the perspective of someone who sometimes cannot find it. He describes lying awake in discomfort, his mind turning over the work he needs to do, the cases he needs to prepare, the students he needs to guide. He is honest about the exhaustion that follows such nights. And, in these passages, the great rhetorician and the imperial student meet each other on entirely equal ground. Both of them tired, both of them human, both of them trying to do their best work in bodies that do not always cooperate. There is something genuinely moving about reading an exchange between one of the most powerful men who ever lived and his aging teacher, both of them grumbling gently about bad nights and celebrating good ones, both of them treating this most fundamental of human experiences with the seriousness it deserves. Sleep, in the world of these letters, is not an interruption of real life. It is a part of life, and an important one. No account of the Fronto-Marcus correspondence could be complete without confronting one of its darkest and most heartbreaking threads. Both men lost children, and the letters in which they write about those losses are among the most raw, most human documents to survive from the ancient world. Fronto and his wife Gratia had several children, and most of them died before their parents did. This was not unusual in the ancient world, where childhood mortality rates were devastating by modern standards. But knowing something is common does not make it easier to bear, and Fronto does not pretend that it does. In letters written after the deaths of his children, he writes with a grief that he does not attempt to philosophize away or dress in stoic resignation. He simply says that he is in pain, that the world seems wrong without these particular people in it, and that time is not healing the wound as quickly as he had hoped. Marcus, who had his own share of tragedy as a father, responds to these letters with a tenderness that is quite unlike the martial and administrative voice we sometimes associate with the author of the Meditations. He tells Fronto that he does not need to explain or justify his grief. He tells him that the loss is real and that it deserves to be felt. He does not offer the consolations of philosophy, at least not in those first, raw moments. He simply offers his presence, his love, his acknowledgement that something terrible has happened and that the pain of it is legitimate. This is significant because it shows us something about Marcus Aurelius that the Meditations alone might lead us to underestimate. The Meditations are a document of self-discipline, of someone constantly coaching himself toward equanimity in the face of loss. But the letters show us the man beneath the discipline, the man who understood grief from the inside and who responded to it in others, not with philosophy, but with compassion. When Marcus Aurelius lost his young son, a child of great promise who died in childhood, Fronto wrote him a letter of consolation that has been preserved and that stands as one of the more remarkable pieces of Latin prose to come down to us from antiquity. It is not a cold philosophical consolation in the tradition of Cicero or Seneca. It is something warmer and stranger. Fronto begins, as was customary, by acknowledging the magnitude of the loss. He does not minimize it or hurry past it. He lets it stand in all its weight, and then he does something unexpected. Instead of moving quickly to the consolatory arguments, the reminders that death is universal, that the soul is immortal, that the wise man does not grieve excessively, he tells stories. He tells Marcus about other parents who have lost children, about the ways they found to carry on, about the ways that love does not disappear just because the person it was directed at has gone. He is writing as someone who knows loss from the inside, who has been where Marcus is standing now, and who wants to offer not an argument against grief, but a kind of company in it. The letter is also honest about its own limits. Fronto acknowledges that there are no words adequate to this situation, that anything he says will fall short of what the moment requires. And yet he keeps writing. Because the act of writing is itself an act of presence, and presence, however imperfect, is what a person in grief most needs. Marcus's response to this letter, in the fragments that survive, is deeply grateful. He thanks his old teacher not for solving his grief, but for sharing it. As Marcus grew older, and his stoic commitments deepened, the tension in the correspondence around the question of philosophy became more pronounced. Fronto, now aging and increasingly concerned about what he saw as his students drift away from the rhetorical tradition he had spent his life defending, wrote a series of letters that amount to something close to a formal argument for the superiority of rhetoric over philosophy. In one of the most discussed passages in the entire correspondence, Fronto makes the case that the great orators of Rome, Cicero above all, had done more for human welfare than any philosopher. They had argued for justice in courts. They had shaped policy in the Senate. They had given the Republic its voice in its most critical moments. What had the philosophers done by comparison? They had sat in their schools and debated the nature of virtue in terms so abstract that ordinary people could not understand them, let alone be helped by them. It is a real argument, not a trivial one, and it is made with all of Fronto's considerable craft. But Marcus's responses to it in the fragments that survive suggest that he was not persuaded. He engages with the argument seriously. He does not dismiss it, but he keeps coming back to the question of what the ultimate goal of a human life is, and his answer, already shaped by his Stoic teachers, is not eloquence, It is virtue. It is the cultivation of the inner self to the point where external circumstances, whether good or bad, can no longer throw you completely off course. And that goal, he had come to believe, was better served by philosophy than by rhetoric. What is remarkable is that this disagreement, which went to the very heart of what both men believed about the purpose of intellectual life, did not destroy the friendship. The letters continue, warm and affectionate, and full of ordinary human detail, even as the two men maintained their philosophical difference. This is one of the most interesting things about the correspondence. It shows that genuine friendship can survive genuine disagreement, even on questions that both parties consider fundamental. Not everything in the correspondence is weighty. Not everything is about rhetoric or philosophy or grief. A significant portion of the letters is concerned with matters so mundane, so everyday, that their survival feels almost miraculous. These are the moments when the letters most completely dissolve the distance between the ancient world and our own. Marcus writes to Fronto about food. He describes eating olives and onions and drinking rough wine at a country estate where he has been staying with his family. He seems to be enjoying himself. He is not performing philosophy or imperial gravitas. He is telling his teacher about a pleasant meal in the way a young man might text a friend to say he had a good dinner. There is something almost silly about reading these passages in the context of everything we know about who Marcus Aurelius would become, and that silliness is a gift. It reminds us that the great figures of history ate olives and drank wine and wrote to their friends about it, just as we do. He also writes about hunting, which was a major aristocratic leisure activity in the Roman world. He describes going out early in the morning with his horses and his dogs, sitting in the forest watching for game, the particular quality of silence that settles over a wood at dawn. These passages have a sensory immediacy that is quite different from the abstract prose of the Meditations. Marcus is noticing the world here, attending to it with a kind of pleasure that he would later, in his philosophical writing, sometimes suggest should be held at arm's length. Fronto, in turn, writes about his own activities between their meetings, the cases he is preparing, the speeches he is composing, the social obligations of a man of his standing. He grumbles affectionately about the demands on his time. He mentions specific people by name, people who have asked him for favors or who have sent him gifts or who have been, in one way or another, tiresome. These passages give the correspondence a texture of real life that no official document could provide. As the years of the correspondence accumulate, a change in Fronto's letters becomes unmistakable. The man who wrote to a teenager about the principles of good prose style is becoming an old man, and his letters increasingly carry the particular quality of late life, a mixture of reflection, physical awareness, and a deepening gratitude for the relationships that have endured. Fronto suffered significantly in his later years. The ailments that had troubled him throughout his life became more severe. He writes with painful honesty about the limits of his body, about days when he cannot write at all because his hands hurt too much, about nights of real physical misery. And yet, even from within this suffering, the quality of his mind and the warmth of his feeling for Marcus do not diminish. If anything, they seem to intensify. as if the narrowing of what his body can do has made him more grateful for what his mind and heart can still reach. Marcus's letters to Fronto during this period are extraordinarily gentle. He asks about his health with genuine concern. He notes when Fronto has mentioned being unwell and follows up in subsequent letters to see if the situation has improved. He sends greetings to Fronto's wife and to members of his household. He treats his old teacher not as a subordinate, which he could have done, being by this time co-emperor of Rome, but as an elder, a beloved elder, someone whose wisdom and experience and continued presence in the world matter to him. There is a passage in one of the later letters where Marcus tells Fronto that reading his words is one of the pleasures he looks forward to, that among all the demands and difficulties of governing the empire, there is something in the arrival of a letter from his teacher that makes things feel better. This is not flattery. It has the ring of something true. The correspondence has become, over decades, a kind of refuge, a space where the emperor could stop being the emperor and remember who he was before the purple. Whatever the philosophical tensions in their relationship, it would be a mistake to conclude that Fronto's influence on Marcus was simply a thing that had to be overcome. The Meditations, composed in a private notebook that Marcus almost certainly never intended anyone to read, are written in Greek rather than Latin. But the training in language that Fronto gave him is visible even there. The precision of the prose, the discipline of the sentence structure, the care with which particular words are chosen over others. These things bear Fronto's fingerprints. More specifically, Fronto taught Marcus something about the relationship between language and thought that no Stoic teacher could have given him. The Stoics were inclined to view language as merely instrumental, as a vehicle for ideas that existed independently of the words in which they were expressed. Fronto's rhetorical tradition insisted that this view was wrong, that the words themselves shape the thought, that choosing the right word is part of what it means to think clearly. This insight, so deeply embedded in Fronto's teaching, runs through the Meditations in ways that are easy to miss if you do not know to look for them. Marcus was also taught by Fronto something about the power of specific detail. The Meditations are full of precise observations about the natural world and about human behavior that go beyond what abstract philosophy requires. Marcus notes the way light falls through a window, the way a dog runs, the way old age changes a face. This habit of attention, this discipline of the observing eye, was part of what Fronto taught. The great rhetorician believed that vivid writing required vivid seeing. And somehow, even as Marcus moved away from rhetoric toward philosophy, that habit of seeing stayed with him. By the time Marcus Aurelius formally became emperor in 161 AD, sharing the title initially with his adoptive brother Lucius Verus, Fronto was an old man, and the correspondence had been going on for roughly 2 decades. The dynamic of the letters had shifted considerably from those early years when a teenager wrote anxiously about his progress in declamation. But the affection had not shifted. If anything, the letters from this period suggest that both men valued the friendship more as they aged, not less. The challenges Marcus faced as emperor were immediate and severe. the Parthian Empire launched an invasion of the eastern provinces in the very year he came to power. Plague broke out. The Danube frontier was under pressure from Germanic tribes that would eventually engulf the empire in a series of wars that would last for most of Marcus's reign. He was a man who had spent his youth reading and writing and thinking in gardens, and he found himself suddenly required to make decisions about battles and epidemics and the survival of millions of people. The letters from this period have a quality of a man still reaching for something stable in a world that has become tumultuous. Marcus writes to Fronto about the demands on his attention, the difficulty of concentrating on anything long enough to think it through properly, the way that the role of emperor fragments a mind that would prefer to be whole. And Fronto, now in his late 60s, writes back with the accumulated wisdom of a man who has spent a lifetime in Roman public life and knows something about the cost of great responsibility. Their correspondence has become, in these years, less like a classroom and more like a conversation between equals who have simply known each other for a very long time. To fully appreciate what Fronto and Marcus were doing, it helps to understand how seriously the Romans took the art of letter writing itself. For educated Romans of the 2nd century, a letter was not merely a means of conveying information. It was a literary form, subject to all the same judgments of style and craft that applied to speeches or histories or poems. When you sent a letter to someone of standing, you were not just communicating, you were performing. Fronto, as the greatest rhetorician of his age, brought the full weight of his literary consciousness to his letters. They are carefully constructed. The transitions are managed with skill. The tonal shifts from formal to warm to gently witty are deliberate. He knows what he is doing at every point, and he taught Marcus to be equally deliberate. This means that reading the letters requires a certain alertness. What looks like an offhand remark may be carefully calculated. What seems like a simple anecdote may be carrying argumentative weight. The apparent casualness of the most conversational passages is itself a rhetorical achievement, the studied ease of someone who has worked very hard to sound effortless. Cicero, in his letters to his friend Atticus, was the master of this mode. Fronto, who admired Cicero enormously, was attempting something similar in his letters to Marcus, and Marcus was being trained by the example of the letters themselves in the same art. There is a meta quality to all of this that is rather lovely. Fronto was teaching Marcus rhetoric partly through instruction, through telling him what principles to follow. But he was also teaching him through demonstration, through the letters themselves, which were models of the very skill being taught. Marcus was learning to write by reading letters written by the best practitioner of Latin prose of his generation, letters addressed specifically to him. The classroom was also the lesson. It is worth pausing here to consider what we are missing. The letters that Cardinal Mai discovered in 1815 were, as we noted, fragmentary. Many are incomplete, some are barely legible, and these are themselves only a portion of what the two men must have written to each other over 30-some years of close friendship. The complete correspondence, if it existed somewhere in its entirety, would almost certainly be one of the great treasures of world literature. What has survived is, by estimation, a small fraction of the whole. The two men wrote frequently, sometimes several times a week when they were not in the same city. They wrote from Rome, from the countryside, from the various estates that Marcus visited as part of the rhythms of imperial life. Fronto wrote from his home, from the baths where he went to ease his physical pain, from wherever he happened to be when the mood to write came upon him. All of those other letters, the ones that were not underneath that particular medieval manuscript in Milan, are lost. This should make us a little melancholy, but also a little grateful. Grateful that the palimpsest existed, that the text was not scraped more completely from the parchment, that Mai was the kind of scholar who looked carefully at what was beneath the visible surface. The survival of historical documents is almost never the result of deliberate preservation alone. It is also the result of accident, of coincidence, of manuscripts ending up in the right monastery at the right moment. The Fronto Marcus letters survived by a very narrow margin. The world in which Marcus Aurelius remains only the stoic emperor and not also the anxious student, the grieving father, the devoted friend, is not very far from the world we actually inhabit. One of the most productive ways to think about the Fronto Marcus correspondence is as a document of a mind being pulled in two directions at once and somehow managing not to be torn apart. Fronto represented one tradition, the rhetorical tradition of civic engagement, of the man who participates in public life through the power of his speech. Marcus's Stoic teachers represented another tradition, the philosophical tradition of inner cultivation, of the man who perfects himself through reason and self-discipline. These two traditions had been in conversation and in tension with each other for centuries before Marcus was born. Plato had attacked the sophists for teaching rhetoric without truth. Cicero had tried to reconcile philosophy and rhetoric in his own person, arguing that the best orator must also be a good man and therefore must know philosophy. The debate was ancient and it was real because it pointed to a genuine question about what human excellence consists of and how it is best pursued. Marcus, in the course of his long life, came down fairly clearly on the philosophical side of this debate. The Meditations leave no doubt about where he found his deepest resources, but the letters show that he did not arrive there easily or quickly, and that he did not simply leave Fronto's world behind when he moved toward philosophy. He carried it with him. The rhetoric teacher's influence does not disappear from the philosopher-emperor's prose. It is absorbed, transformed, and integrated into something new. This is how education actually works, not as the replacement of one set of ideas with another, but as a slow, complicated process of making different things your own. Fronto died sometime around 166 AD, though the exact date is uncertain. By that point, he was probably in his mid-60s, which was a good age for the ancient world. Marcus had been sole emperor for about 5 years, following the death of his co-emperor Lucius Verus. The correspondence does not end with a dramatic final letter. What we have simply trails off, the way the written record of any long relationship eventually trails off. The last letters we possess from Fronto to Marcus are those of an old man who is still thinking clearly, still caring about language and about his student, still interested in the world even as his body has made that world increasingly difficult to inhabit. There is no sign of the bitterness that age sometimes brings, no evidence that his losses, and they had been many, had made him small. He remained to the end the large-spirited, generous, intellectually alive man that the earlier letters reveal. We do not know what Marcus wrote when Fronto died, or whether there was time for a final exchange between them. We do know, from the Meditations, that Marcus remembered his teachers throughout his life with something close to reverence. He lists them in one of the most moving passages of that private notebook, naming each one and noting what specific thing he learned from them. Fronto is there. Marcus credits him simply and specifically with having helped him understand what envy, deceit, and hypocrisy look like among those who claim to be noble. It is a strange tribute, and not obviously complimentary at first glance. But it tells us that Marcus saw his teacher clearly, in all his human complexity, and loved him anyway, which may be the truest form of love. It is worth pausing here to consider Fronto not only in his relationship with Marcus, but also in the broader context of his life as a teacher and public figure. He was not only Marcus's tutor, he was also the teacher of Lucius Verus, Marcus's adoptive brother and eventual co-emperor, and the letters give us occasional glimpses of the very different way that relationship functioned. Lucius Verus was, by almost every account, a man of very different temperament from Marcus. Where Marcus was serious, introspective, and drawn to philosophy, Lucius was gregarious, pleasure-loving, and more inclined toward the enjoyments that the Roman aristocratic life had to offer. He liked gladiatorial games and chariot racing and the lavish entertainments of the court in a way that Marcus found somewhat troubling. Fronto, interestingly, seems to have had genuine affection for Lucius as well, though the tone of his letters to him is noticeably different. With Marcus, Fronto is intellectually demanding, pushing back, asking hard questions, refusing to be satisfied with anything less than full engagement. With Lucius, the letters that survive suggest a warmer but less challenging dynamic. This tells us something about Fronto as a teacher. He was not applying a single method to all his students. He was reading them, understanding what each one needed, and adjusting accordingly. This is the mark of a truly gifted educator, someone who understands that the goal is not to replicate yourself in your students, but to help each student become more fully what they already are. Marcus needed to be pushed toward rigor and precision. Lucius needed something different, and Fronto, for all his strong opinions about what constituted good Latin and good thinking, was flexible enough to provide what each student required. Educated Romans also took the maintenance of correspondence seriously as a form of social fabric. To write to someone was to signal that you valued them. To write well was to show them the full quality of your attention and care. Letters were often read aloud in households, shared with family members, kept carefully, and sometimes eventually published. The private and the public were not as sharply separated in Roman letter-writing culture as we might assume. This means that both Fronto and Marcus would have been aware, even in their most apparently personal moments, that what they were doing had a public dimension. They were not naive about this. But the awareness did not make the letters less genuine. It simply made them more carefully made. Reading the Fronto Marcus letters alongside the meditations creates an interesting double perspective on the long process of self-formation that Marcus underwent. In the letters, we see the formation happening in real time, a young man being shaped by his encounters with language and ideas, and a remarkable teacher. In the meditations, written decades later, we see the result of that formation, but also the evidence that Marcus never considered himself finished, never thought he had arrived at a point where the work of becoming a better person could stop. This is, in fact, one of the most important things that Fronto and Marcus's Stoic teachers had in common, even if they disagreed about almost everything else. Both the rhetorical tradition and the Stoic philosophical tradition shared a fundamental commitment to the idea that excellence is achieved through continuous practice and that it can always be lost if practice ceases. The great orator does not reach a point where he no longer needs to study and refine his craft. The wise man does not reach a point where he no longer needs to examine his thoughts and feelings for the errors that always threaten to creep back in. Both traditions understood human excellence as a process, not a destination. Marcus absorbed this lesson deeply. The meditations are a practice, not a treatise. They are the notes of a man who is still working on himself, still finding himself falling short of his own ideals, still beginning again each morning. And in that quality of perpetual recommencement, we can hear an echo of Fronto's schoolroom, of the patient, demanding teacher who would never let a good effort stand as a sufficient one, who always believed that the next attempt could be better than the last. There is a moment when you are reading the fragments of these letters when the gap between the ancient world and our own seems almost to close. A phrase catches you off guard. Something Marcus says about being tired, or something Fronto says about the difficulty of concentrating when the body is in pain, strikes with the force of pure recognition. These are people, not marble, not concepts, not the simplified figures that history tends to make of those it considers great. They are people who slept badly and ate olives and worried about whether their writing was good enough and loved each other across the distance that life imposes. The palimpsest, that image of writing beneath writing, is almost too perfect as a metaphor for what these letters reveal. The official history of Marcus Aurelius is the top layer, the clear and legible text. Philosopher-emperor, Stoic sage, the last of the 5 good emperors, the author of the Meditations. That text is real, and it matters. But beneath it, if you look carefully, if you are the kind of reader who attends to what lies under the surface, you find another text. The text of a young man uncertain of his gifts, a student who feared disappointing his teacher, a grown man who missed his friend when they were apart, a father who grieved his children with unphilosophical rawness, a ruler who found relief from the weight of governance in the simple act of writing a letter to someone who knew him well. That undertext does not contradict the official history. It does not make Marcus less admirable or Fronto less impressive. It makes them both more real. And reality, however complicated and imperfect it is, has a kind of beauty that no simplified version of human greatness can quite replicate. Scholars who have studied the letters in their original Latin have noted something that translation tends to flatten. Fronto and Marcus use language with each other that draws on the vocabulary of Roman family relationships, calling each other by terms that carry connotations of deep kinship. This is not accidental. In Roman culture, the relationship between teacher and student was frequently understood through the lens of the paternal bond. The teacher was a kind of second father, particularly in the context of the philosophical schools, where students sometimes lived in close proximity to their teachers and looked to them for guidance on questions that went well beyond the formal curriculum. For Marcus, whose biological father died when he was very young, this dimension of his relationship with Fronto may have had particular weight. The letters sometimes have a quality that goes beyond what we would expect, even from a warm teacher-student bond. There is a longing in them, particularly in Marcus's early letters, that sounds like the longing of someone who is reaching for a kind of security and recognition that has its roots in something deeper than intellectual admiration. Fronto, for his part, clearly understood this dimension of what was being asked of him and responded to it generously. He was not only teaching Marcus how to write, he was being a certain kind of presence for him, stable and demanding and honest and warm, the kind of presence that helps a person understand who they are and who they might become. This is not something that any formal educational arrangement can prescribe. It is something that either happens or it does not, depending on the particular chemistry of two particular people at a particular moment in time. For Marcus and Fronto, it happened, and the evidence of it fills every page of the surviving correspondence. The Romans had a complex relationship with books and with the written word that helps explain why a correspondence like this one mattered so much to both men. In the world before printing, texts were rare and precious and fragile. They circulated in manuscript copies that introduced errors and variations. They could be lost in a fire, destroyed in a political purge, or simply deteriorate into illegibility over time. The great library at Alexandria had burned. Roman senatorial archives had been deliberately destroyed by emperors who wanted to erase the record of inconvenient events. Nothing written was entirely safe. And yet the Romans wrote obsessively. They kept letters, they composed memoirs, they wrote histories and philosophical treatises and rhetorical exercises and personal notebooks. They did this partly because they believed that writing was one of the ways a person extended their life beyond its natural limits. To be remembered was a form of immortality, and being remembered required leaving some trace of oneself in the written record. Fronto, as the greatest rhetorician of his generation, would have been acutely aware of this. He would have known that his letters to Marcus had a chance of being preserved, read, and perhaps eventually published. This knowledge shapes the letters without overwhelming them. They are not simply performances for a future audience. The genuine emotion in them is too consistent, too various, too human for that. But they are also conscious performances, the work of a man who knew what he was doing and was doing it well. That combination of genuine feeling and artistic consciousness is one of the things that makes the correspondence so interesting as a literary artifact. It belongs to both the life and the art, and it does not apologize for belonging to both. One of the more charming threads running through the later correspondence concerns books. Both Fronto and Marcus were voracious readers in a world where reading required real effort, where every book had to be copied by hand, and where even wealthy households might own only a few dozen volumes. They recommend texts to each other, argue about authors, express enthusiasms and dissatisfactions with the kind of unguarded directness that book lovers recognize immediately. Fronto, predictably, steers Marcus toward the great Latin authors of the Republic and early Empire. He is particularly devoted to the writers of the period before Cicero, the so-called archaists, whose Latin had a roughness and directness that Fronto found more honest and more powerful than the polished urbanity of the Ciceronian style. He recommends Ennius, the archaic poet, and Cato, the stern moralist of the Republic, and various other writers whom later Roman taste had passed over in favor of the Ciceronian mainstream. This is characteristically Fronto, always willing to swim against the current of received opinion, always looking for the genuine thing rather than the fashionable one. Marcus reads what Fronto recommends, but also ranges widely on his own. His Stoic teachers have pointed him toward the Greek philosophical tradition, and his letters mention Greek authors with a familiarity that suggests not occasional dipping, but sustained engagement. He is reading Plato and Epictetus and the earlier Stoics. He is clearly thinking hard about what he reads and bringing it into connection with his own life and his own developing sense of what matters. The letters show us a reader not merely accumulating knowledge, but actively working with it, testing it against experience, discarding what does not hold up and keeping what does. The books they discuss are, of course, mostly lost. We know the titles, but often not the texts. The great library of ancient literature that Fronto and Marcus could draw on is largely inaccessible to us now. But the fact that they discussed books so readily, so naturally, as a normal part of the flow of their correspondence, tells us something important about what reading meant in their world. It was not a leisure activity, bracketed off from real life. It was one of the primary ways that educated Romans thought and communicated. Books were part of the conversation, not apart from it. It is worth thinking for a moment about the physical reality of these letters, the actual objects that passed between the two men. A letter in the Roman world was typically written on wooden tablets covered with wax, or on papyrus, depending on the formality of the occasion and the length of the message. The writer would use a stylus on wax tablets, scratching letters into the surface. For longer letters, papyrus was more practical, written with a pen made from a cut reed dipped in ink. Once written, the letter would be entrusted to a messenger, usually a household slave, whose job was to serve as a courier. The messenger would carry the letter from the sender to the recipient, a journey that might take hours if they were in the same city, or days if they were separated by any significant distance. There was no postal system for private correspondence, no guarantee that the letter would arrive safely or on time. Messengers could be delayed, could fall ill, could get lost. Letters could be damaged in transit, could arrive wet from rain, could be opened by someone they were not intended for. This physical precariousness is present in the correspondence. Both men mention letters that seem to have gone astray, responses that arrive unexpectedly late, situations where a misunderstanding has arisen because a letter did not reach its destination when expected. The unreliability of ancient communication is one of the conditions under which the friendship operated. You could not be certain your words would arrive. You could not be certain you would hear back quickly. And yet both men kept writing, accepting the uncertainty as one of the conditions of their situation and continuing the conversation as best they could under the circumstances. There is something in this that resonates deeply with our own experience of communication, though the technology is entirely different. The anxiety of not knowing whether a message has arrived, the relief when a reply finally comes, the misunderstandings that arise when communication is imperfect, these are human experiences that transcend the particular medium through which they happen. Fronto and Marcus, waiting for letters across the city or across the empire, were experiencing something that anyone who has ever waited for a message they needed would immediately recognize. The Fronto-Marcus correspondence did not become famous in the ancient world in the way that Cicero's letters to Atticus did. Cicero himself had arranged for his letters to be published, and they circulated widely. Fronto's letters, by contrast, seem to have been preserved more privately, kept by those who had them rather than actively distributed. This may be why they survived in a form that required discovery rather than simply being a well-known part of the ancient literary tradition. After Fronto died, Marcus continued to reign for another 13 years, facing challenges that seemed to multiply rather than diminish. The wars on the Danube frontier consumed enormous resources and required Marcus himself to spend long stretches of time in camp, far from Rome, conducting military operations that he found personally distasteful. He was not a warlike man. He had been trained as a scholar, not a soldier, and yet circumstances required him to become, in middle age, a capable military commander. He managed this without ever losing the philosophical orientation that had shaped him, but at real cost to his health and his peace of mind. It was during those military campaigns on the northern frontier that he wrote most of the Meditations. We can imagine him in the evenings when the day's military business was done, sitting alone in his tent or in his travelling quarters, writing in Greek by lamplight, talking to himself on paper in the way that the long decades of correspondence with Fronto had taught him to find valuable. The habit of putting words to his inner life, of using writing as a form of thinking, had been formed in those early years of letters, and it persisted in a different form and for a different purpose to the very end of his life. He died in 180 AD, probably in what is now Vienna, on the Danube frontier, still in the middle of his military campaigns. He was 58 years old. The empire he left behind was still intact, still powerful by any ordinary measure. But the pressures that would eventually break it apart were already visible to those with eyes to see. The plague had weakened the population and the economy. The frontier wars had strained the military to its limits. The golden period that the 5 good emperors had presided over was drawing toward its close. Marcus knew this, or suspected it, and the Meditations carry in their darker passages a quality of someone who is aware that the tide is turning and that there is no philosophical principle adequate to fully reconcile a person to that knowledge. There is one more dimension of the letters worth dwelling on before we allow them to rest. It is the dimension of gratitude. Both Fronto and Marcus express gratitude to each other frequently and specifically throughout the correspondence, but not in the hollow, formulaic way that gratitude is often expressed between people of unequal power. They are grateful for particular things, grateful for specific letters that arrived at the right moment, grateful for pieces of advice that proved useful, grateful for corrections that were hard to hear but necessary, grateful, above all, simply for each other's continued presence in a world that both men knew was impermanent. Roman philosophy had a great deal to say about gratitude. The Stoics considered ingratitude one of the more serious moral failures, a sign that a person had lost touch with the proper understanding of their dependence on others and on fortune. Seneca wrote an entire treatise on the subject of benefits and the obligation they created. But the gratitude in the Fronto-Marcus letters is not the dutiful gratitude of philosophical compliance. It is something warmer and more spontaneous, the gratitude of people who genuinely feel lucky to have found each other in the enormous, indifferent world. There is a particular poignancy to reading these expressions of gratitude, knowing what we know about the eventual fate of the correspondence. The letters were not preserved through any deliberate act of reverence. They were not consciously treasured by later generations who understood their value. They survived by accident, by the ordinary medieval practice of scraping parchment clean and writing over it, which paradoxically preserved a ghost of the original text. The gratitude these two men felt for each other did not save their words. Only luck did that, and that luck, centuries later, allows us to feel something that is perhaps its own form of gratitude. Gratitude for the accident that preserved them. Gratitude that the palimpsest was not scraped more thoroughly. Gratitude that Cardinal Mai was paying close enough attention to notice what lay beneath the surface. The Roman world was, by the time of Marcus Aurelius and Fronto, already old. The Republic had been dead for nearly 2 centuries. The emperors who had succeeded each other since Augustus had ranged from the brilliant to the monstrous. Romans of the educated class were simultaneously proud of their civilization and melancholy about its direction, proud of what Latin literature had achieved and anxious that nothing new of comparable quality was being produced. There was a pervasive sense in the 2nd century of living in the shadow of a greater past. Fronto's devotion to the archaic Latin writers, his preference for Ennius and Cato over Virgil and Horace, was partly a response to this feeling. If the present cannot match the past, you can at least try to recover what was best in the past and hold it up as a model. Marcus Aurelius, shaped by this world and shaped by Fronto specifically, found a different response to the same anxiety. Rather than looking backward to a golden age of Latin eloquence, he looked inward, toward the resources of the individual soul. The Meditations are, among other things, an argument that what matters most about a human life does not depend on the condition of the civilization in which that life is lived. A person can be virtuous and thoughtful and genuinely good in a declining empire just as well as in a flourishing one. The external circumstances of life matter less than we tend to think. The inner ones matter more. We live in an age that is suspicious of the idea of the great man. We have learned, rightly, to be skeptical of simplified versions of greatness, to look for the full human being behind the monument, to notice what was missed or ignored or harmed in the making of a celebrated life. The Fronto Marcus letters are useful here, not because they reveal some hidden flaw that topples the pedestals, but because they reveal something more interesting. They reveal two people who were already complicated, already contradictory, already in the middle of the same fundamental human struggle that all of us are in. The struggle to think clearly, the struggle to be honest, the struggle to love well, the struggle to accept loss without being destroyed by it, the struggle to keep working on yourself even when you are tired, even when you are in pain, even when the world outside is in chaos. That is not a flaw in the monument. That is the monument. The real monument to Marcus Aurelius is not the column that still stands in Rome, or even the meditations that still sell in bookshops all over the world. It is the fact that across 3 decades of private correspondence with an old teacher, he kept showing up, he kept writing, he kept asking questions and accepting answers, even hard ones. He kept being honest about his doubts and his failures and his love. And somewhere in the ongoing dailiness of that, in the accumulation of all those letters sent and received across the years and the miles, something was made that has lasted. Not just the words, the man himself. What passed between them was something that is harder to name than we might expect. It was education, certainly, in the most literal sense. Fronto taught Marcus how to write Latin, how to construct an argument, how to choose a word. But it was also something that operates outside the curriculum entirely. It was the experience of being known by someone who does not have to be kind to you, who would not lose anything by being less than honest, and who chooses, day after day and letter after letter, to be both honest and kind. That experience, which Fronto offered Marcus across more than 3 decades, is one of the rarest things a human being can receive. And Marcus, for his part, gave something back that was also rare. He gave his teacher the experience of being genuinely valued by someone with the power to be indifferent. He wrote back, he engaged, he argued and questioned and pushed back, and then accepted correction. He allowed himself to be formed. He stayed in the relationship, even as the relationship became more complicated, even as his philosophical convictions moved away from his teacher's deepest beliefs. He found a way to disagree without withdrawing. This, too, is a rare thing. There is a thought that returns again and again as you read these letters. It is the thought of everything that was happening in the world while these two men were writing to each other. The empire was at the height of its power when the correspondence began and was beginning its long, slow decline by the time it ended. Hadrian built his wall in Britain. The Parthian Wars convulsed the eastern provinces. The plague of Antoninus, probably smallpox, swept through the empire, killing millions. The Germanic tribes pressed against the northern frontier with an urgency that would not abate until, centuries later, the Western Empire fell entirely. All of that was happening. And in the middle of all of that, a teacher and his student were writing to each other about sleep, about olives, about the right word for a particular kind of grief, about why rhetoric is better than philosophy, or maybe it is the other way around. The ordinary human things, the things that matter to people even when history is happening all around them, perhaps especially when history is happening all around them. The letters remind us that even in the largest lives, it is often the smallest things that sustain us. A letter from someone who knows you. The news that a friend has slept well. The memory of sitting in a garden eating rough food and feeling, for a moment, entirely at ease. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire of 50 million people, fought wars on multiple fronts, presided over plague and famine, and wrote philosophy that is still read 20 centuries later. And through all of it, he kept writing to his old teacher. He kept sending letters across the city or across the empire to a man who would read them carefully and write back with honesty and love. The palimpsest waited in Milan for more than 1,000 years. The words were almost lost, but they survived beneath the surface of another text, patient and quiet, as good things often are. And when they were finally found, they told us something that all the official histories and administrative records and philosophical treatises could not quite tell us on their own. They told us what it felt like, from the inside, to be a human being trying to become something worthy, trying to learn, trying to love, trying to sleep well enough to think clearly the next morning and do it all again. That, perhaps more than anything, is why these letters matter. Not because they belong to history, though they do, not because they illuminate a great emperor's formation, though they illuminate it brilliantly, but because they are the record of two people taking each other seriously across a long span of time. And that is the most human thing there is. Thank you for listening. Good night, and sleep well.